"You can let go now," I said. He let go. "But since you've announced to a room full of people that my money gives me no rights here," I continued, "I want to ask one more question. In front of your guests, in front of Claire's guests, in front of your parents, who are standing right there." I nodded toward a table to the left, where Derek's parents had risen from their chairs, faces tight. "In front of my daughter." Claire had appeared at the edge of the circle. I hadn't seen her approach. She was standing very still in her ivory dress with the lace overlay, and her face was unreadable in the way her face sometimes got when she was absorbing something large. "Did you know," I said, not to Derek but to the room, quietly, honestly, without drama, "that your son, your husband, attempted to have me removed from my own daughter's wedding, from an event I funded in its entirety? I'm not saying that to reclaim ownership. I'm saying it because some things need to be named out loud, because some things should not happen in silence." Derek's mother made a sound. His father had sat back down. Derek himself had done something I hadn't expected. He had gone very still. The heat under his face had extinguished, replaced by something colder and more inward-looking, and for a single moment I saw through the surface to something that was almost a kind of shame. Almost. The security men had stepped back. They had not been paid enough for this particular situation. Nobody had. Elaine Suarez appeared at my shoulder. She had been in the building all evening because that was the kind of professional she was. And she placed a hand briefly on my arm and said, quietly in my ear, "I have the file. Everything documented. Would you like me to share it?" I said, "Not tonight." She nodded and stepped back. What happened in the following hour was not what you might expect. There was no explosion. There was no screaming match, no overturned tables, no dramatic exit with a slammed door, and tears in the parking lot. What happened was a reception that continued, because 240 people had traveled and dressed and rented hotel rooms and arranged babysitters, and it would have been a cruelty to reduce all of that to the consequences of one man's miscalculation. Claire and I sat together at a corner table for 20 minutes. Derek had been steered by his best man toward the bar and then outside onto the veranda. Diane came and sat with us, put her hand over Claire's hand, and said nothing. Robert stood behind Diane's chair in the steady way that was the best thing about Robert, and he also said nothing. And the nothing from both of them was exactly right. Claire said, "I'm sorry, Daddy." I said, "You have nothing to be sorry for." She said, "I should have." "No," I said, "you shouldn't have done anything differently. You were doing the best you could with what you had. That's all any of us can do." She looked at me. "I called you," she said. 5 weeks ago. I called you." "I know," I said, "and I came." She nodded once, and then she looked across the ballroom at her wedding, at the ivory peonies and the champagne linens and the chivari chairs and the Southern Table catering staff moving between tables with elegance, and she took a long, slow breath. "I love this room," she said. "I know," I said. "I spent a long time on the chairs." She laughed, a real one, clear and open and absolutely herself. The investigation and the legal proceedings that followed the wedding night did not happen quickly. They rarely do. What happened in the weeks and months after May 11th was a slow, methodical process of naming things that had existed in the dark and bringing them into the light where they could be examined properly. Derek had, in the months leading up to the wedding, on at least 4 documented occasions, made physical contact with Claire in ways that she had minimized, rationalized, and absorbed into a framework she'd built to make the relationship survivable. A shove during an argument in November that had left her off balance against the kitchen counter. A grip on her wrist during a disagreement in January that had left a bruise she'd explained to me, at the time, as the doorknob. Priya, her neighbor, had witnessed the aftermath of one incident and had kept a written record of it in a notes application on her phone, dated and time-stamped, because Priya was 26 and smart and had already decided that records mattered before any of us knew they would be needed. Claire had also, as it turned out, sent herself emails, a habit she'd developed in February. After reading an article about documenting domestic situations, she had sent detailed emails to an account Derek didn't know about, describing specific incidents with dates and locations. When her attorney, a woman named Marguerite Blanchard, who came to me through a veteran friend of mine at the Legion Post, reviewed those emails, She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your daughter has been preparing for this for 4 months. She just didn't know who she was preparing for." I thought about that for a long time. Marguerite was a small woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of direct, unadorned communication style that I respond to instinctively. She did not waste sentences. She did not soften things into shapes that were easier to hold. She looked at me across her desk on a Thursday morning in late May, 3 weeks after the wedding, and told me exactly what the situation was, what could be proven, what would be argued, and what the likely outcomes were. "You understand," she said, "that you have no formal standing as a litigant here. This is Claire's process." "I understand that," I said. "I'm here to support it." "Good," she said, and then she looked at me for a moment. "Claire mentioned you were Army." "2 tours," I said. She nodded. "I thought so," she said without explaining what she meant, and moved on. We gathered what we had: Priya's time-stamped notes, Claire's emails, the incident report from the wellness check in April, photographs that Claire's friend from college, a woman named Denise who had been at the apartment 2 days after one of the incidents in November, had taken on her phone when Claire's sleeve had ridden up to reveal the bruise on her wrist, not at Claire's request, but because Denise had trusted her instincts and said nothing at the time, and kept the photographs anyway. A statement from a neighbor on the floor below who had, on 2 occasions, heard raised voices and something that sounded like impact from the apartment above. It was not, Marguerite told us, a criminal case. Not yet. Possibly not ever, depending on Claire's choices and the strength of what could be presented. What it was, clearly and immediately, was grounds for an annulment and, subsequently, a restraining order. The marriage was 4 weeks old. The day we appeared in family court in Charleston was a Thursday in mid-June, one of those summer days in South Carolina when the air sits on you like a warm, wet cloth, and even the courthouse steps seem to sweat. Claire wore a pale blue dress and her hair was pulled back, and she sat straight in the chair beside Marguerite at the plaintiff's table with a stillness that I had never seen in her before. Not the careful, managed stillness of someone trying not to take up too much space, but the deep, rooted stillness of someone who had decided what they were and was no longer negotiating it. Derek was across the room with his attorney, and when I looked at him, I tried to do what I had told myself I would do, which was to look at him as a whole person rather than the worst version of himself. I had thought about this for a long time in the weeks before the hearing. The anger I had, and I had it. A cold, specific anger that I kept carefully contained and useful, rather than letting it become loud and destructive. The anger was not for the person Derek might have been before whatever had shaped him into what he'd become. The anger was for what he had done with that shaping, for the choices he had made, for the 2 years in which my daughter had reorganized herself around his requirements. I don't hate him. I want to say that plainly, because it's true and because I think the truth matters more than the dramatically satisfying version. I don't hate Derek Whitmore. I hate what he was willing to do to someone I love. That's a different thing, and keeping the distinction clear made it possible for me to sit in that courtroom and say what I needed to say without my voice shaking. I was called to testify for approximately 25 minutes. I described the wellness check in April. I described the conversation with Priya on the Tuesday I'd come to Charleston with tomatoes and an instinct. I described 2 years of Christmas dinners and birthday gatherings and 4th of July barbecues, piece by piece, with the dates and the details and the exact words, the way you do when you've been keeping an internal record without meaning to. I was asked by Derek's attorney whether I had a personal vendetta against the defendant, and I said no, I had a professional concern for my daughter's safety and a parental concern for her well-being, and that those 2 things were consistent with each other and with the evidence. Derek's attorney moved on. When Claire testified, the room changed. Not dramatically. The room was largely unchanged. The fluorescent lights and the institutional furnishings and the quiet procedural atmosphere of the court. But something shifted. A subtle reorientation, like a compass settling. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not cry. She did not apologize for what she was saying or soften it with caveats. She used names and dates and the specific, concrete language of a woman who had rehearsed nothing but prepared everything, and the courtroom listened to her in the particular way that people listen when they know they are in the presence of something real. I want to tell you something that happened on what should have been the happiest day of my life. And I need you to understand, when I say that, I mean it exactly the way it sounds. Not one of the happiest days. Not a very special occasion. The happiest. The day I had been thinking about since my daughter Claire was 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor of our house on Maplewood Drive, flipping through the pages of a bridal magazine she'd found at the dentist's office, pointing at dresses and saying, "Daddy, that one. That's the one I want when I grow up." She was 7, and I remember standing at the kitchen counter with a dish towel over my shoulder, looking down at her, and feeling something I still don't quite have words for. It was love, obviously, but it was also this enormous sense of responsibility, this quiet promise I made to myself, right there in that ordinary kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that I would do whatever it took to give that girl the day she deserved. I kept that promise. I kept it for 23 years, through a divorce and a recession and a surgery that wiped out most of my savings one summer, through nights when I wasn't sure I had enough left in the account for the next month's mortgage, through every holiday season I spent alone after her mother and I split, working extra shifts so I could keep building the fund I'd started the year Claire was born. A simple account at Coastal Heritage Bank, nothing fancy, just a place where I put money every single month without fail, labeled in my own handwriting on a folded note card I kept in the back of my wallet. Claire's Day. I kept that promise. And then, on the evening of May 11th, in the grand ballroom of the Harbor View Estate in Beaufort, South Carolina, a venue I had personally contracted, personally toured 3 times, and personally written a check for, a man in a rented tuxedo grabbed me by the arm in front of 240 guests, called over a security guard, and told him, and everyone close enough to hear, that I was a disruptive guest who was trying to ruin their perfect day. His name was Derek Whitmore, and he was my son-in-law of exactly 4 hours. I'm going to tell you everything, every single piece of it, because it matters. Not just as a story about one terrible evening, but as a story about what happens when a quiet man finally stops being quiet. About what it costs to love someone so much you let them walk into a burning house while you stand outside holding a bucket of water, waiting for them to ask. About what it means, in this life, to finally understand the difference between patience and silence. My name is Gerald Holt. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years driving long-haul freight before a back injury retired me early, and for the 11 years before that, I'd done 2 tours in the Army, which is not something I bring up at dinner parties. I live alone now in a small house on the outskirts of Georgetown, South Carolina, with a beagle named Fletcher and a vegetable garden that produces more tomatoes than one man could ever eat. I am not a dramatic person. I do not raise my voice in public. I do not make scenes. I want you to understand that, because what happened on May 11th looked, from the outside, like a scene. It was not. It was the natural, quiet conclusion of something that had been building for 2 years, 9 months, and approximately 16 days. And by the time Derek Whitmore's hand closed around my arm in front of those 240 guests, every single thing that followed had already been decided long before that ballroom. If you've ever watched someone you love disappear into another person, not all at once, but slowly, the way water erodes stone, then you already know the particular kind of fear I'm talking about. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up on a Tuesday morning when you realize you haven't heard your daughter laugh freely in 4 months. It sits with you at 2 in the morning when you replay a phone call in your head and wonder what she meant by a phrase she used. A phrase that didn't quite fit. A phrase that felt like a signal. If any of that sounds familiar to you, I need you to stay with me until the very end of this story. Because I promise you, it matters how it ends. And if you're just now finding this channel, or if something in those first few sentences already reached inside you and touched something real, please take a moment right now to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what this story is bringing up for you. Stories like this one don't belong locked inside one family. They belong to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of someone else's pain and wondered what to do next. This channel exists because of you. So please, stay with me. 3 years earlier, none of us could have imagined how May 11th would go. 3 years earlier, my world was small and quiet and mostly fine, the way a life gets after the big storms have passed, and you've rebuilt enough to feel stable again. I'd been retired from the road for 2 years by then, still adjusting to the strange stillness of days without a destination, without a route, without the particular company of the radio and the miles. My house on the outskirts of Georgetown was small, 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a yard that backed up to a line of loblolly pines, and it suited me perfectly. Fletcher was still a puppy then, a ridiculous, long-eared catastrophe of a dog who had already destroyed 2 pairs of boots and 1 perfectly good garden hose, and I loved him with an unreasonable intensity that I would have denied to anyone who asked. My mornings had a rhythm. Up at 5:30, coffee on the back porch while the light came up slow over the pines, then an hour in the garden before the heat got serious. 3 days a week I volunteered at the American Legion post over on Church Street, mostly helping with their food pantry and occasionally driving older veterans to their VA appointments over in Charleston. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me connected to something larger than myself, and after a lifetime of being useful in loud ways, I had quietly come to appreciate the slower kind of useful. I had been divorced from Claire's mother, Diane, for 14 years. It had been the kind of divorce that was sad without being catastrophic. 2 people who had simply grown into different shapes, who were better to each other apart than they had been together for the last several years of the marriage. Diane had remarried a good man named Robert and lived up in Charlotte, and we were civil in the way that people can become civil when enough time passes, and the wounds close into scars. Claire was the bridge between us, and to her enormous credit, she never exploited that position. She handled both of her parents with a grace that still humbles me when I think about it. Claire was 28 when Derek came into her life. She was living in Charleston then, working as a graphic designer for a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, and she was doing well. She had her own apartment over in West Ashley. She had a cat named Biscuit who tolerated visitors with royal condescension, and she had a circle of friends she'd had since college who seemed to genuinely love her. She called me every Sunday, not because I asked her to. She'd started doing it on her own sometime in her mid-20s, and it had become one of the anchors of my week. Sunday at noon, without fail. Claire's voice on the phone telling me about her week, asking about Fletcher and the tomatoes, and whether I'd been sleeping properly. She was good at asking about sleep. She got that from her mother. When she told me about Derek, it was a Sunday call in late August. I remember it specifically because I was pulling dead sunflowers from the garden bed along the fence, my phone balanced against the fence post on speaker, and she had this energy in her voice that I hadn't heard in a while, a brightness. Something lifted. "I met someone, Daddy," she said. Just like that. I met someone and I think he might be important. Derek Whitmore was 32 at the time, a commercial real estate broker operating out of downtown Charleston. She described him as tall, dark-haired, well-dressed, funny in a quick, sharp way, confident without being arrogant. He had a boat, she mentioned, almost as an aside, a 22-foot center console he kept at a marina on Shem Creek, and she said it like it was a charming detail, not a defining one, which I appreciated. He had taken her out on it the first weekend they dated, and they'd watched the sun set over the harbor, and she said it had been simply wonderful. I listened. I asked questions that I hoped sounded easy and natural. I told her I was happy she sounded happy. I told her I couldn't wait to meet him. I met him 6 weeks later, at a restaurant in downtown Charleston called the Indigo Table, a place with exposed brick walls and waiters who knew the name of the farm where the chicken was raised. It was a Saturday evening in October, cool enough for a jacket, and Claire had been nervous on the phone that morning in the way she got nervous before things she cared about, talking slightly too fast, shifting topics. Derek was already at the table when we arrived. He'd gotten there early, which I noted, and which seemed like a good sign. He stood up when we walked in. He was tall, as advertised. Strong handshake, direct eye contact, the kind of easy smile that looks effortless because it's been practiced enough to become effortless. He had on a blazer over a dark button-down, no tie, and he wore it well. He called me Mr. Holt 3 times in the first 10 minutes, then switched to Sir with a slight self-deprecating laugh, saying, "Claire told me you were Army, so I figure Sir is safer." I laughed. I meant it. It was a good line. We talked through dinner about his work, about Charleston's real estate market, about his family. 2 weeks later, I drove to Charleston on a Tuesday, something I rarely do unannounced, under the pretense of dropping off a bag of tomatoes and some pecans from my sister's tree. Claire was at work. Derek was, I'd made sure, at a client meeting until 4. I knocked on a neighbor's door, a young woman named Priya who lived next door to them, who Claire had mentioned was a friend. And I introduced myself, and I asked her, plainly and quietly, if she had ever noticed anything that worried her. Priya looked at me for a long moment, and then she stepped aside and let me in. She told me things she'd been carrying for months. A wall, a voice, once, raised loud enough to hear through the shared wall of the apartments late at night, and Claire's voice afterward, very quiet, saying something placating. A bruise that Claire had explained as walking into a doorknob, which Priya had not believed. Small things, but Priya said them with the steadiness of someone who had been waiting for the right person to tell. I thanked her. I left the tomatoes. I drove home, and I started to prepare. The wedding had been in the planning stages for 8 months by the time I had that conversation with Priya. Claire and Derek had gotten engaged the previous spring on a sunset boat trip that Derek had arranged and that Claire had described to me with a happiness that I'd tried very hard to simply receive, without the shadow I was already carrying by then. She had called me right after from the boat, voice light and breaking slightly with something that I think was genuinely joy. And I had said all the right things. I meant them. I meant every one of them, because whatever was complicated about Derek, my daughter's happiness was not complicated. It was real. And it was enough in that moment to be glad for the part that was real. They had not discussed how to fund the wedding in any formal way, at least not initially. The topic drifted into my life gradually, the way large expenses tend to, first as a general conversation about venues, then about costs, then about who was in a position to help. Derek's parents were contributing $15,000. Diane and Robert were offering $10,000. And Claire, at the end of a Sunday call that spring, had said carefully, almost apologetically, "Daddy, you've always said you had something set aside. I don't want to presume." "Tell me what you need," I said. She told me. The number was substantial, but not impossible. The Harborview estate alone was $42,000 for the Saturday evening package. Catering, flowers, photography, music, the dress, the invitations, the rehearsal dinner. By the time we had walked through the full scope of what Claire and Derek were planning, my contribution sat at just over $112,000. I had it. I had been putting money aside since she was born, and I had it, and there was no version of reality in which I would not have written that check. I want to be precise about this, because it matters for what comes later. Every vendor contract for the Harborview estate wedding was signed either by me personally or by the wedding coordinator I had hired, a meticulous woman named Mrs. Elaine Suarez, who understood exactly what she was working with and who kept records the way some people keep religion, with devotion and absolute rigor. The flowers were from a florist on Queen Street in Charleston with whom I had a signed agreement and a 50% deposit already paid. The catering was a local company called Southern Table, contracted in my name. The venue's deposit, the second payment, and the final payment, all cleared from my personal account at Coastal Heritage Bank. My name was on every invoice, every receipt, every confirmation email. Derek did not know this. In the months of planning that followed the engagement, he had involved himself in choices, the venue, the menu, the band, with the comfortable authority of someone who believed, without ever explicitly checking, that he was the primary architect of his own wedding. The money had flowed through Claire's accounts in some cases, or through Mrs. Suarez, and Derek had simply never asked the question that would have revealed the answer. He had assumed. And assumptions, in my experience, are the most expensive things a man can carry. In the meantime, I was watching Claire. The fragments kept coming. A dinner in March where she arrived alone, without explanation, and seemed relieved by the quiet of my small house in a way that made my chest hurt. A phone call in April where she started crying mid-sentence about something small, a disagreement about seating arrangements, and then caught herself and apologized, and I said she had nothing to apologize for, and she said, "He just has very specific ideas," and the word "just" was doing so much work in that sentence that it nearly broke under the weight. And then, on a Wednesday evening in early April, 5 weeks before the wedding, my phone rang at 11:17. I know the time because I checked it when I heard the vibration and saw Claire's name on the screen and felt the cold, specific alertness of a man whose body knows before his mind does that something is wrong. I answered. There was a sound that took me a second to identify. Wind, I thought first, or static, And then I realized it was breathing. Controlled. Trying to be quiet. Claire? Silence. Then, so quietly I had to hold the phone against my ear and press, "Firefly." One word. That was all. I was out of the chair before the word finished. I don't remember standing up. I remember Fletcher raising his head and watching me with those long-eared, anxious beagle eyes as I went to the closet for my keys, my jacket, my phone charger. I remember being in the truck, a 2019 Ram, black, because after decades of driving other people's vehicles, I'd allowed myself one indulgence, and pulling onto the highway before I had consciously made a plan. I remember calling 911 from the road, explaining the situation in the clearest terms I had. My daughter was at her apartment in Mount Pleasant. She had given me a prearranged distress signal. I had reason to believe she was in danger, and I needed a wellness check at that address. The dispatcher was a calm woman who asked steady questions, and I answered them steadily in return. And she told me units were being dispatched, and I told her I was approximately 45 minutes out, and I would be complying fully with whatever they asked of me when I arrived. And she said, "Stay on the line with me, sir." I did. I drove through the dark on Highway 17 with the window cracked and the radio off, the dispatcher's voice in my ear, and I was not panicking. This is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who hasn't been trained the way I was trained. But panic is a choice you can defer when the situation requires it. You can hold it at the edge of the room and tell it to wait its turn. I had learned that in the Army when I was 23, and I had never fully unlearned it, and on that road in the dark, with my daughter's silence still in my ear, I was grateful for every hard thing I had ever been asked to do that had taught me how to be useful instead of afraid. I was grateful that I had been the kind of man who stayed on the line. The lights of the bridge over the Cooper River came into view just after midnight. By the time I reached the apartment complex on Oyster Point Drive, 2 patrol cars were already in the lot, lights going, and a third was pulling in behind me. I parked and walked toward the nearest officer with my hands visible and my voice low, identifying myself as the father who had called in the wellness check. The officer, a young woman named Martinez according to her name tag, told me they'd made contact and that the situation was being assessed. She asked me to wait by my vehicle. I waited. I did not argue. I did not push past her. I stood by the truck and watched the windows of the second-floor apartment and breathed. 12 minutes later, Claire came out of the building's side door, escorted by a second officer. She was wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, and she had no shoes on, and when she saw me, she walked faster, and then she was in front of me, and I put both arms around her, and she made a sound against my shoulder that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not crying exactly. Something older and deeper than crying. Something that had been held in for a very long time. I held her. I didn't say anything. I just held her. Derek had come to the door when the officers knocked, and he had been, according to what Claire told me later, and what was noted in the incident report, calm, cooperative, well-dressed, mildly confused. He had told the officers there was a misunderstanding, that his fiancée was perfectly fine, that her father had a history of overreacting. He said this with the confident, measured tone of a man who was accustomed to being believed. The officers had asked to speak with Claire separately. He had hesitated before agreeing. Claire had told them, in that private conversation, that she was not in immediate physical danger that night, but that she had been afraid, and that she had contacted her father because she didn't know what else to do, and that she needed to leave. They had helped her gather some things. They had brought her out to me. Derek had not been arrested that night. There were no grounds for it. He had not, in the end, touched her that evening. He had simply spent 2 hours telling her, in the careful, private language of a man who understood deniability, that she was lucky anyone wanted to marry her at all, and that the wedding was going to happen the way he planned it, and that if she involved her father in one more decision he considered his to make, she would regret it. Not a threat, he would have said, just clarity. But Claire had heard something underneath the clarity that scared her, and she had said the word. What happened after that, in the 5 weeks between that night and the wedding, is complicated in the way that real things are complicated, and I have to be honest about all of it. Claire did not leave Derek that night. She went back. Not that same night, but within the week, after conversations I was not part of, after a cycle I recognized and grieved without being able to stop. She called me on a Sunday and told me, carefully, that things had been addressed, that Derek had apologized, that they were going to couples therapy, and that the wedding was still on. She said it in a voice that was steadier than I expected, and underneath the steadiness, I heard something that I recognized as a decision. Not a surrender, but a choice. Made for reasons I might not fully understand. Made by a woman who was still, in some very real sense, finding her way toward her own clarity. I did not argue. I did not issue ultimatums. I told her I loved her. I told her she knew the word. I told her I was not going anywhere. And then I called Elaine Soares. "Elaine," I said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to make sure that every contract, every vendor agreement, every invoice for this wedding remains in my name. Not Derek's, not Claire's, mine. Can you do that for me?" There was a brief pause. "Mr. Holt," she said, "it already is." I cannot adequately describe my gratitude for Elaine Soares. May 11th arrived the way important days always do, faster than expected and freighted with too much light. I woke at 5:30, as always, made coffee, sat on the back porch. Fletcher put his head in my lap. The sky over the pines was the particular shade of pale gold that shows up on mornings when the air is still and the light hasn't decided what to do with itself yet. I sat there for 45 minutes, drinking coffee, letting the morning be what it was. I'd brought my truck to Beaufort the day before and stayed at a Hampton Inn on Bay Street. I was showered and in my suit, charcoal gray, a tie Claire had picked out for me the previous Christmas, dark burgundy with a small pattern she said made me look distinguished, daddy, not old, by 8 in the morning. The ceremony was at 2. The Harborview estate was everything it had been when I'd toured it the previous fall. A restored antebellum property at the edge of Beaufort's harbor, surrounded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss, with a formal garden and a grand ballroom that could seat 300 comfortably. The flowers along the ceremony aisle were pale ivory peonies and garden roses, which I knew because I had chosen them with the florist on Queen Street in October, going through the catalog with my reading glasses on, and my coffee going cold on the table. The chairs were white-painted Chiavari chairs, rental arranged through Mrs. Soares. The tablecloths in the ballroom were a specific shade of champagne that Claire had described to me from a swatch sample in her apartment, and which I had matched to the correct linen vendor after 3 conversations. Every flower, every chair, every fold of champagne-colored linen, paid for in full from the account at Coastal Heritage Bank, labeled in my handwriting, Claire's Day. I saw Derek briefly before the ceremony, at the edge of the garden where the groomsmen were gathering for photographs. He was in his tuxedo, tall and assembled and confident, and he looked at me across the garden with an expression that was almost nothing, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a contained acknowledgement. I gave him a nod. He looked away. Claire was extraordinary. I want to say this clearly and fully, because no matter what else is part of this story, this is the center of it. My daughter was extraordinary. The dress was ivory silk with a lace overlay, and she had found it herself, tried on alone at a boutique in downtown Charleston with Priya and 2 other friends, and when I'd seen the photograph she texted me that afternoon, I'd had to sit down. She looked like herself, completely, undeniably, fully herself, which is the best thing any bride can look like. Walking her down the aisle, I said one thing to her, very quietly, when we reached the point where the music swelled and the guests rose and the world went large. I said, "You can always come home." She squeezed my arm. She nodded once, and she walked forward. The ceremony was beautiful. The officiant was warm and intelligent. The vows were personal and real, and when Derek said "I do," he said it with what looked like genuine feeling. And I sat in the front row and I let myself hope. Not fully, not without reservation, but a genuine small hope. Because hope is the thing you owe the people you love, even when experience has complicated your accounting. The reception began at 5:30. Cocktail hour in the formal garden, reception dinner in the ballroom, a band called the Tidewater Strings, who played everything from the jazz standard Claire had requested for the first dance to the Motown that got Diane and Robert on the floor by the 3rd song. I ate well. The Southern table catering had outdone themselves. The she-crab soup alone would have justified the entire evening, and I danced with Claire to a Stevie Wonder song she'd loved since childhood, and for about 90 minutes I was, quite simply happy. I was at the bar talking to my sister Patrice's husband Len about his recent fishing trip to the Outer Banks when it happened. It was approximately 8:45 in the evening. The reception was in full swing, the dance floor active, the room warm and loud with 240 people well fed and well watered and celebrating. I had just ordered a second bourbon. I had nursed my first across 3 hours because old habits, when I heard Derek's voice behind me, at a register that was not quite loud enough to be a shout but was clearly intended to carry. Mr. Holt. I turned around. He was standing approximately 4 feet from me, tuxedo still sharp, tie still straight, with that contained, assembled quality he had. But there was something different in his face tonight, a heat underneath the surface control, something that had been building all evening. I would learn later that Derek had made a phone call an hour earlier to the catering manager to ask about adjusting the dessert service, and the catering manager had told him politely that any changes would need to go through Mr. Holt, as he was the named client on the contract. That had been the first crack. "We need to have a word," he said. Len had gone quiet beside me. I picked up my bourbon, took a single sip, set it down. I turned to face Derek fully. "All right," I said. "I've had 3 different vendors tell me tonight that I need to go through you for any decision. My wedding vendor, my florist, the catering company. Apparently," and here his voice dropped, sharpened, "you seem to think that because you wrote some checks you're in charge here." I looked at him without answering. Behind me I could feel Len very still. "This is my wedding," Derek said. "Mine and Claire's, and I need you to understand your role here, which is guest, not host, not decision-maker." "Guest." "Okay," I said. "Good. Then I need you to step back and let us run our own event." "Okay," I said again. He stared at me. The single-word answers were not what he'd prepared for. He'd expected argument. He'd been building for argument, marshaling his certainty, his social authority, his comfortable knowledge that he was the groom and I was just the father-in-law, and without argument to push against, his momentum had nowhere to go. He made a decision then. I watched him make it, that clear, specific moment when someone trades calculation for impulse. He turned and raised his hand, a summoning gesture toward the door where 2 event security staff were posted, large men in dark jackets. And then he turned back and placed his hand on my arm above the elbow, and he said, loudly enough for the people nearest the bar to hear distinctly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You've been interfering all evening, and I won't have you disrupting our perfect day." The music hadn't stopped, but the people at the bar had, and the couple at the table nearest to us, and the wedding party at the high top to my left, a circle of silence spreading out from us like a ripple from a dropped stone. One of the security men was moving toward us. Derek said, for the benefit of the room, "My father-in-law seems to think his money gives him ownership of this event. It doesn't. I want him removed, please." I let him finish. I let the security man get within 6 feet of us. And then I spoke. Not loudly. There was no need. The circle of silence around us was already large enough. "Derek," I said, "but before you go any further with this, I want to ask you something." He was still holding my arm. He had not let go. I did not shake him off. "Who is the named client on your venue contract?" I asked. He blinked. "Who is the named client on your catering contract? Your floral contract? Your linen rental? Your photography? Your band? Your bar service?" The security man had stopped. "Every contract for this event," I said, "is in my name. Every invoice, every receipt. The $42,000 deposit on this venue, that's in my name. The catering, Southern Table, $12,000 for the evening. That's my contract. The flowers you're standing next to were chosen by me in October, from a florist on Queen Street, paid in full by me last March. The chairs you're standing on," and I kept my voice level, unhurried, almost gentle, "were arranged by Elaine Soares at my instruction and billed to my account." The room was very quiet now. "I don't want ownership of your wedding, Derek. I never did. I wrote those checks because my daughter asked me to, and because I have been putting money aside for her since she was born. That's what fathers do." I looked at his hand on my arm. An acknowledgement that the conversation he wanted to have was with me, not with her. It was 3 pages, handwritten on plain white paper in a careful, upright script, and it had been mailed from a post office in Augusta, Georgia, which was near where his parents lived. I read it twice before I called Claire. He wrote about the wedding. He wrote about the moment in the ballroom when he'd turned to summon the security guard, and he said, in a sentence I have kept, because it was honest in a way I hadn't expected, that the moment he did it, he'd known it was wrong, and that some part of him had done it anyway because he hadn't known how to stop. He wrote about the therapy he'd begun, mandated as a condition of the restraining order, but he said he'd have sought it anyway eventually, though he acknowledged that eventually might have meant never. He wrote about his father, briefly and obliquely, in a way that did not excuse anything, but that gave me, reading between the lines, a rough sketch of where some of it came from. He wrote about Claire. He wrote that he was sorry, and he wrote it without asking for anything in return, which made it more believable than the kind of apology that arrives with its hand out. He did not ask to see her. He did not ask to revisit the annulment. He did not ask me to do anything with the letter except read it. I called Claire that evening. She was quiet while I read her the relevant parts. She asked me to read the section about the wedding again. I did. She was quiet for a while after that. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think he wrote it," I said. "I think some of it is real." "Does that mean I have to forgive him?" "No," I said. "Does it mean I should?" I thought about that for a moment. "I think forgiveness is a decision you make for yourself," I said. "Not for the person who hurt you. If you get there, it'll be because it's useful to you, not because it's owed to him. And if you don't get there, that's all right too. You're allowed to take as long as you need, or never, and both of those are legitimate." She was quiet for a moment. "What about you?" she said. "Are you going to forgive him?" "I'm working on it," I said. "I think I'm about halfway there. Some days further." She made a small sound that was the beginning of a laugh. "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying," I said. We talked for a while longer about other things. The new apartment, Dr. Webb, Thomas, and the No-Way project he was working on involving the migration patterns of loggerhead sea turtles, which Claire described in a voice that contained a warmth I was choosing not to analyze yet. I told her about Ruby and the pancakes and the syrup. She laughed. We said good night. I sat on the back porch for a while afterward with Fletcher against my leg, looking at the pines. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over Georgetown were sharp and plentiful in the way they get in November, when the humidity finally releases its year-long grip, and the sky goes back to being all the way itself. I thought about the letter. I thought about Derek, somewhere in Augusta, sitting down to write those 3 pages, and what that must have taken. I thought about my daughter, who had spent 2 years of her life reorganizing herself around a person who was not worthy of the effort, and who had come out the other side of it not broken but altered, which is not the same thing, who had sent herself emails in the dark as preparation for a fight she hoped she wouldn't need to have, who had said a single word into a phone at 11:17 on a Wednesday night and trusted that someone would come. I thought about all the things I wish I'd done differently, the years I'd been on the road, the months after the divorce when I'd built a wall inside myself and called it resilience, the moment on the 4th of July balcony with Derek when I could have said something more and chose the neat, composed answer instead, because I was afraid of being cut off from Claire entirely. I thought about those things honestly, without the softening that hindsight sometimes offers if you're not careful about demanding accuracy from yourself. And then I thought about the things I'd done right. The account at Coastal Heritage Bank, labeled in my handwriting. The word firefly, invented on a Tuesday evening when Claire was 17, and I was heading out for 6 weeks on the road, and I'd wanted her to have something. The drive in the dark at 11:30 on a Wednesday, hands steady on the wheel, window down, dispatcher's voice in my ear. The truck in the parking lot of the apartment complex with the lights of the bridge visible in the distance, and my daughter walking toward me with no shoes on, and the sound she made when I put my arms around her. Standing in the Harborview Estate ballroom with 240 people listening, and saying in the quietest voice I had, the things that needed to be said. You don't have to be perfect to be the person someone needs. You just have to be present. You have to be the kind of person who answers the phone when somebody is afraid, even when the call comes at 11:17, and even when the only word they say is one you both hoped they'd never have to use. You have to be willing to drive in the dark toward whatever is waiting at the end of the road, without knowing exactly what you'll find, and trust that the training you've accumulated across a life of difficult things has prepared you well enough for this particular difficult thing. You have to keep the account. Not because you'll ever want credit for it. I want to be clear about this, because the whole point is that you don't keep the account for the credit, but because love, real love, requires you to build something in advance of the need, to put something aside each month, labeled in your own handwriting, against the day when the person you love needs to know that someone was planning for them before they had to ask. The following spring, a year and a half after May 11th, Claire called me on a Saturday, not a Sunday. She said, "Daddy, I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Thomas proposed last night." The world went very still and very warm at the same time. She said, "And I said yes, but I wanted to call you first." "First?" I said. "It's Saturday morning." "I know. I called you instead of sleeping." I laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and old and genuinely glad, the kind that has nothing performed in it. I said, "Tell me everything." She told me everything. He'd taken her to the harbor at sunset. On a boat, she said, laughing, and he'd had a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a simple band with a small oval sapphire, and he'd asked her in a voice so quiet she'd almost had to ask him to repeat it, which was just exactly right. She said yes the second time through, before he finished the question. We talked for an hour. We talked about the proposal, and about Thomas, and about her apartment, and about whether they'd stay in Charleston, or might eventually think about somewhere larger or smaller, about Biscuit's likely reaction to cohabitation, about whether Fletcher would get along with a potential future dog. We talked about the wedding, when, where, how big, what kind. Small, she said, immediately and with a certainty I recognized as hers, the full, clear kind that had been emerging more and more consistently since the previous year. Small and real, just people who actually matter. Good, I said. And Daddy? Yeah. This time I'm handling the contracts myself. I laughed again, that deep, old, genuine laugh. Smart, I said. She said, I learned from the best. I want to tell you something about strength, because I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I think I finally understand it well enough to say it plainly. Strength isn't what I thought it was when I was young. When you're young, strength looks like dominance. It looks like the person who wins the confrontation, who overpowers the obstacle, who comes out on top and walks away clean. And there's a version of that night in the ballroom at the Harborview Estate that looks like that version of strength. An older man standing his ground. A younger man forced to back down. A room full of witnesses. But that's not what the strength was. The strength wasn't in the ballroom. The strength was in 32 years of truck driving, putting money aside in a labeled account at Coastal Heritage Bank. The strength was in a conversation with a 17-year-old girl before a 6-week haul, inventing a word together so she'd always have a way to reach me. The strength was in standing on a porch in Georgetown, holding a phone, 11 days after hearing something that scared me deeply, and not running toward the problem before I understood it well enough to be useful. The strength was in a young woman named Priya, keeping time-stamped notes on her phone because her instincts told her to. The strength was in my daughter, sending herself emails in the dark, building a case she wasn't sure she'd ever need to use, in preparation for a version of herself she hadn't quite found yet, but was already making room for. The strength was in her voice on that Wednesday night, quiet as a breath, saying one word into the phone. Strength isn't winning fights. Strength is answering the phone when somebody is afraid. Strength is the thing you build quietly, over years, out of ordinary materials. Money set aside, words chosen carefully, presents offered consistently, so that when the moment comes that requires everything you have is actually there. And love, real love, the kind that holds. It isn't the grand gesture on the boat at sunset, or the declaration in the middle of the ballroom. It's the account you open when your child is born, and add to every month without fail. It's the word you invent in the kitchen before a long trip, so she always knows how to call you home. It's showing up in the parking lot with no plan except to be there, because that was enough, and you knew it was enough, and you came anyway. That's the story I've been carrying since May 11th. He was from a small town in Georgia, one older brother, parents still married and living in the same house he'd grown up in. He asked about my driving career and seemed genuinely interested rather than politely so, asking follow-up questions about routes and weather and the particular loneliness of long stretches of highway at 3 in the morning. Claire watched us both across the table with that careful brightness in her eyes, monitoring for approval, and by dessert I could see her visibly relax. I drove home that night thinking that I liked him. Not completely, not with the open-handed certainty I'd have liked to feel, but enough. There had been one moment at dinner, small, almost nothing, when Claire had started a sentence and Derek had finished it for her in a way that wasn't playful or affectionate, but just slightly ahead of her, like an interruption dressed as a completion. She hadn't reacted. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was one of those fathers who examines every man his daughter brings home for hairline fractures, because the job of a father is structural inspection as much as it is warmth. I told myself I was probably reading too much into it. By Christmas that year, Derek was part of the family gathering. We did a small Christmas at my place. Claire and Derek, Diane and Robert driving down from Charlotte, my sister Patrice and her husband Len from Columbia. I'd spent 3 days making my mother's recipes: a standing rib roast, sweet potato casserole with the pecan crust, biscuits from scratch, a rum cake that I started 2 days early. It was the kind of Christmas I love, the kind that smells like butter and pine and effort. Derek arrived carrying an expensive bottle of wine and a wrapped box of chocolates for Diane, which she appreciated visibly. He was charming through dinner, telling stories that landed well, refilling glasses without being asked. And then, during a lull after we'd moved into the living room, he looked around at the house, at the modest furniture, the family photographs on the walls, Fletcher asleep by the fireplace, and said, almost to himself, but loud enough to carry, "It's a good thing Claire has good taste, because she clearly didn't inherit the decorating gene." He said it with a smile. He said it with the tone of a joke. Claire laughed. A short, contained laugh. And in that laugh, I heard something that I recognized, the way you recognize an old song you haven't heard in years. Something slightly off-key, slightly too quick. A laugh that was more about managing a moment than enjoying one. Her shoulders had done a small thing, a brief tightening, so fast that anyone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. I watched for it. I said nothing. I handed Derek his wine and steered the conversation somewhere else and watched Claire across the room for the rest of the evening, cataloging the small ways she adjusted herself around him. The almost unconscious editing of her own sentences, the way she glanced at him before committing to an opinion, the slight half-second hesitation before she laughed at something one of her relatives said, as if checking first to see whether Derek found it funny. Patrice caught my eye across the room at one point that evening, just for a moment, and I knew she'd seen it too. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. That was December. By Easter, I had a cleaner picture, and I did not like what it showed. We'd gathered at Diane and Robert's house in Charlotte, a bigger gathering, 11 people, a backyard full of tulips and too many cousins, the warm kind of loud that Easter dinners can be. Derek had driven up with Claire, and from the moment they walked in, there was something different in how Claire carried herself. A careful, upright attentiveness that was hard to name but easy to feel, like a person standing beside something fragile that they're responsible for not breaking. The episodes that followed over those months were not dramatic. I want to be very clear about that. They were the kind of thing that, presented individually to an outside observer, would receive a shrug, a raised eyebrow maybe. Nothing more. Derek corrected Claire in front of the group when she told a story differently than he remembered it. He made a comment about her tendency to exaggerate when she laughed too loud at something Robert said. He once, at a birthday dinner for Diane in June, ordered for Claire before she'd finished looking at the menu. Not the way a couple does it when one knows the other's preferences, but in the quick, decisive way of someone accustomed to being the one who decides. Each individual thing was small. Together, they were a map. And the most disturbing thing was how well he'd calibrated them. They were never egregious enough to demand a response. They were always draped in the shape of humor or concern or practicality. When Diane once gave Derek a look that was a shade too direct, he laughed it off with a self-aware comment about being an acquired taste. And somehow the room laughed with him, and the moment dissolved, and he was charming again. And you were left standing there, holding the ghost of something that technically hadn't happened. He tried his calibration on me once. It was at a 4th of July cookout at his and Claire's apartment. They'd moved in together by then, in a nice 2-bedroom in Mount Pleasant, and we were standing on the balcony together while the others were inside, the harbor visible in the distance, the evening warm and blue-gray. He'd had 2 bourbons. I was drinking sweet tea. "Claire tells me you were pretty checked out when she was a teenager," he said. Friendly voice. Looking at the water. I looked at him. I took a sip of my tea. "She talk about that often?" I asked. "She mentioned it," he said, and then turned to look at me with that smooth, measured smile. "I'm just saying. She had it pretty rough, and you weren't around much. She doesn't say it like that, but it's obvious." I held his gaze for a moment. He was waiting for something. Embarrassment, defensiveness, anger. Something he could manage and then report back to Claire as evidence of my issues. I said, and then I refilled his glass, said, "Good evening for it," and went back inside. He blinked, just slightly. He didn't know what to do with that. Good. I want to be honest here about something. I want to tell you the part that is harder for me to say out loud, harder than anything about Derek. I had been watching Claire disappear for almost a year by that point, and I had not done enough. I'd made calls. I'd asked careful questions during our Sunday conversations that she always answered with soft reassurances. "Daddy, I'm fine. Derek just has a strong personality. He doesn't always mean it how it sounds." I'd had one direct conversation with Diane over the phone, in which we had both expressed concern and then talked ourselves halfway into believing we were overreacting because we needed to believe it. And I had pulled back, not because I didn't care, because I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose her entirely. The thing nobody tells you about that kind of fear is how reasonable it feels from the inside. How every instinct you have says, back off, be patient, be available but not demanding, be a safe place she can return to rather than another pressure on her. And maybe that's right sometimes. Maybe there's wisdom in that. But sometimes it's just fear wearing the costume of wisdom. And I had let it wear that costume for too long. I didn't discover the full truth all at once. It came in fragments. The way things do. The way a picture becomes recognizable not when you see any single piece but when enough of them connect. The fragment that mattered most came on a Sunday in February, 14 months before the wedding. Claire called at the usual time and the call was fine. She told me about a project at work. Asked about Fletcher, mentioned they were thinking about getting a kitchen table to replace the one they had. Normal. Easy. And then, near the end of the call, in a pause that was maybe 2 seconds longer than usual, she said something that she immediately walked back. She said, I miss being able to, and then she stopped, cleared her throat. "Never mind. I'm just tired. Long week." I let it go in the moment, but I didn't let it go. "Claire," I said very quietly, "you know the word, right?" There was a pause. "What word?" she said, but her voice had changed. "The word we picked when you were 17, I said, before I went on the road for that long haul. The one that means come immediately, no questions, no conversation." Another pause. Longer this time. "Firefly," she said, very softly, almost a whisper. We had invented it together. She'd been having a bad year when she was 17. Trouble with a friend group at school, a situation with a boy that never became dangerous but that I'd watched carefully, and I was about to go on a 6-week run from Charleston out to Nevada and back. I'd told her, if you ever need me, I mean ever, for any reason, for anything you can't say out loud, say the word and I come home. No explanation needed, no judgment, I just come. She had never used it, in 11 years. Not once. "I know it," she said, still soft. "I know the word, Daddy." "Okay," I said. "That's all." We said goodnight. I sat on my back porch for a long time after the call ended, watching the dark line of the pines against the sky. Fletcher curled against my ankle. I was thinking the way I used to think at night in the Army. Not emotionally, not yet, but strategically. Taking inventory. Deciding what I knew and what I didn't know and what I was going to need to know. At one point, Derek's attorney asked her why she had continued the relationship and proceeded with the marriage if she had documented these incidents and experienced this fear. And Claire looked at the attorney for a moment, and then she said, very calmly, "Because I loved him. And because when you love someone, you keep trying to believe the version of them that doesn't hurt you, until you can't anymore." The judge, a quiet, careful man named Judge Ellis, who had been on the family court bench for 16 years, and who had, according to Marguerite, seen every version of every story that involved love going wrong, wrote something on his notepad. The annulment was granted 4 weeks later. A restraining order was issued simultaneously, requiring Derek to maintain a distance of 500 feet from Claire, from my home, and from Claire's workplace. Derek's attorney had requested supervised visitation rights, which were irrelevant and confusing to everyone present since there were no children, and which Marguerite addressed in 2 sentences. Derek did not speak in the courtroom except to answer questions. He answered them in the flat, cooperative tone of a man who had recognized, somewhere during Claire's testimony, that the narrative he had been managing was no longer his to manage. Marguerite shook Claire's hand on the steps of the courthouse. Then she shook mine. She said to Claire, "You were extraordinary in there." She said to me, "You both were." I drove us to lunch at a restaurant on East Bay Street that Claire had wanted to try, a small place that did wood-fired oysters and cold soup and bread you couldn't stop eating. We sat outside on the sidewalk in the thick June heat, and we ate slowly and we talked about very little. The food, the boats on the harbor, whether Biscuit the cat had forgiven Claire for the disruption to his routine. There was a tiredness between us that was not unhappy. The tiredness of people who have carried something heavy for a long time and have just finally been allowed to set it down. At one point, Claire looked up from her soup and said, "Thank you, Daddy." I said, "You did that. I was just there." She shook her head. "You were there before I asked. You were there the whole time." I looked out at the harbor. A pelican was sitting on a piling 20 yards away, utterly still, looking at the water with a patience that seemed ancient. "You did the hard part," I said. "The hard part was yours." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. We sat like that for a while in the heat, in the city that smells like salt and old brick and river, and it was quiet, and it was enough. The summer and fall that followed were not easy, but they were real, and real is something I had come to value more than easy a long time ago. Claire moved into a new apartment in late June, a 1-bedroom in downtown Charleston, 2 blocks from the firm where she worked, on the 3rd floor of a building with a wide balcony that caught the harbor wind in the evenings. She painted the walls herself, a warm white she called "not quite cream," and she bought furniture that was entirely her own choosing. A velvet sofa in a deep green, a reading chair she found at an antique shop on King Street, a wooden dining table with mismatched chairs that she assembled in her kitchen over 2 Saturday mornings with Priya. Biscuit reconstituted himself on the velvet sofa within 48 hours, as though nothing had ever disrupted his world, which I found both impressive and instructive. She started therapy in July. Not couples therapy this time, but her own. A private practice therapist named Dr. Annalise Webb, whose office was near Colonial Lake, and who Claire described to me on one of our Sunday calls as the kind of person who asks you questions so good it takes you 3 days to answer them. I said that sounded like exactly the right kind. She called me every Sunday. The calls were different now, longer somehow, more open, less carefully edited. She told me things she'd been carrying for a long time. Some of those things were about Derek, and some of them were about years before Derek, about the divorce, about the teenage years, about the specific texture of growing up between 2 households and working so hard to be fine that you never quite got around to being honest. I listened. When she asked questions, I answered them honestly, including the ones about my own failures, the years I'd been too far down the road to be present, the months after the divorce when I'd retreated into work so completely that I'd missed things I shouldn't have missed. "You came back," she said on one of those calls. "You always came back. Not always fast enough," I said. "No," she said fairly. "Not always fast enough. But you came." I was doing my own kind of rebuilding, too. I won't pretend otherwise. The years of quiet on that porch in Georgetown, the years of useful small volunteering, the years of Fletcher and the tomatoes and the solitary Sunday mornings. Those had been good years mostly, but there had been something in them that I hadn't fully named until after May 11th, when the naming of things was on my mind, a kind of voluntary diminishment, a habit of making myself smaller than necessary, under the theory that smallness was courtesy. I had confused self-effacement with respect, and the confusion had cost me. In July, I rejoined a book club at the Georgetown Library, a thing I had attended once, 3 years prior, and then quietly stopped attending for no good reason. The group was 7 people, ranging from a retired schoolteacher named Marlene to a 45-year-old harbor master named Chester, who read exclusively naval history and viewed the fiction selections with a suspicious squint that I found deeply entertaining. We met on the second Wednesday of every month and argued about books in the way that people argue when they care and are well fed, which is to say with genuine feeling and no damage. I looked forward to it every month. Chester said to me at our third meeting as we were walking to our cars afterward, "You seem lighter lately. First time you came, you were carrying something." I thought about that. "I was," I said. "Good that it's lighter," he said. I thought about it the whole drive home. In early September, Claire called me on a Tuesday evening rather than a Sunday, which was unusual, and asked if she could bring someone to my house for a Sunday dinner in 2 weeks. I said, of course. She said she wanted me to meet a friend. Just a friend. A man she'd met through Priya who worked as a marine biologist with no AA out of Charleston. She said his name was Thomas and he was quiet and kind and he'd been patient with her about the whole year she'd been having, and that she wasn't telling me this to make it a big thing, just to tell me. "He patient with you or patient for you?" I asked. She laughed. "Both," she said. "There's a difference, right?" "Big one," I said. Thomas came for dinner in September, a Sunday in the middle of the month when the summer had finally started to ease and the evenings were cool enough to eat on the porch. He was 34, medium height, with a quiet steadiness about him that I registered immediately and appreciated. He did not fill silences with noise. He asked Claire questions when she talked, and actually listened to the answers, rather than preparing his next contribution while she spoke. He helped with the dishes without being asked, and knew how to dry a pan without leaving streaks, which sounds like a small thing but reveals character more reliably than most large things. He played with Fletcher in the backyard for 20 minutes while Claire and I cleaned up, and Fletcher, who is an excellent judge, and a suspicious one, draped himself across Thomas's foot and went to sleep, which is the Beagle equivalent of a formal endorsement. When they left that evening, I stood on the porch and watched their car back down the drive, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A lightness, the way Chester had said. Something set down that I'd forgotten I was still carrying. My granddaughter, well, she wasn't my granddaughter yet, technically, but she was close enough in spirit. Was Claire's niece, actually, my sister Patrice's granddaughter. A 7-year-old named Ruby, who had been at the wedding reception and had apparently absorbed more of the evening than any of us had realized. Ruby was a compact, intensely observant child who asked questions with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be indirect about anything. She came with Patrice to visit me in October, a weekend visit, and on Sunday morning at the kitchen table while I was making pancakes, Ruby looked up from her glass of orange juice and said, "Papa Gerald, why did that man at the wedding make you leave?" I turned from the stove. Patrice, at the far end of the table, looked at me over her coffee with an expression that said, entirely plainly, "She's been asking me for months, and I've been waiting for this." I turned the burner down. I came to the table and sat down across from Ruby. "He made a mistake," I said. Ruby considered this. "What kind of mistake?" "He thought because he was loud and certain. That made him right," I said. "But being loud and certain doesn't make you right. It just makes you loud and certain." Ruby thought about this. "Were you scared?" she asked. "No," I said. "I was sad." "Why sad?" I thought about how to say it. "Because I wanted that night to be happy for Claire," I said. And it was, mostly. But it also had something hard in it. And sometimes that's how important nights go. Happy and hard at the same time. Ruby nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Mama says you were brave," she said. "Your mama's generous," I said. "She says you just stood there and told the truth and you weren't even yelling." "That's right," I said. "Why weren't you yelling?" I turned back to the stove. "Because the truth doesn't need to yell," I said. "It just needs to be said." Ruby was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I have extra syrup?" I gave her extra syrup. The letter from Derek arrived in November, 6 months after the wedding. It came to my address in Georgetown, not Claire's, which I thought might have been intentional. That's the weight that's been getting lighter. Slowly. The way the right weights do. When you finally set them down properly, not dropped and forgotten, but placed with intention, understood, and released. Fletcher is asleep under my chair right now. It's early morning in Georgetown. The pines are catching the first light, and my coffee is getting cold because I've been sitting here thinking about all of you, about whoever is listening to this, whoever this story reached, wherever you are, and whatever version of this you've been living. If you are a parent watching someone you love disappear slowly into someone else, I need you to hear this. You are not overreacting. What you are seeing is real. And your presence, your steady, prepared, available presence, matters more than you know. Stay ready. Keep the account. Remember the word. If you are the person who needed to call someone at 11:17 and didn't, or did, I need you to hear this. You are not too much. You are not a burden. The people who love you have been building toward your call for longer than you know. Let them answer. If you've been watching this story and something in it has moved something in you, something specific, something that belongs to your own life and your own family, I'd really ask you to leave a comment below. Tell me what it stirred. Tell me what part of this story landed somewhere real for you. I read every comment, every single one, and they matter to me in ways I can't fully explain, except to say that the distance between one person's story and another's is much smaller than it looks. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do. Right now, if you haven't. Stories like this one, real ones, imperfect ones, ones that don't tie up neatly into perfect bows, deserve to find the people they belong to. And the only way they travel is if you help carry them. Claire and Thomas are getting married in October. A small ceremony, she tells me. Just people who actually matter. I've been told, very firmly, that I am welcome to attend as a guest, that my only responsibilities are to show up on time, dance at least once, and not make any speeches longer than 3 minutes. I've been working on the speech for 2 months. It's currently at 4.5 minutes, and I'm going to need a little more time. The last thing I want to say, the thing I most want to leave with you, the thing I've carried all the way from May 11th to this morning on the porch, is this. The truth doesn't need to yell. It just needs to be said. It's